Okay, so with Rogers and Maslow, they're probably the best two known humanistic theorists. But Rogers is better known for his work in psychotherapy, okay, his client-centered approach to therapy, okay, meaning that it should be directed by the client, okay, rather than the therapist being the one to direct the direction of the therapy sessions. Now, he was really influenced by the philosophy to do with phenomenology, okay. Now, phenomenology is a philosophical movement that really became popular through the work of Martin Heidegger. And what it was really arguing was that scientists had been focused for too long on studying people's objective reality, okay, and not enough on their subjective perceptions. So, for example, we could go outside and we could measure the temperature objectively and have an objective measurement of reality. But that doesn't mean we would all experience it the same. We would experience it differently. Some people would find it too hot. Some people would find it too cold. Okay. And so, reality is not something that's so objective that people don't experience it differently. And, it's based upon this Greek word for phenomenon that means to shine forth. But really what it means is that which shines forth for you. Okay. So, if you're reading a book, for example, and maybe there's a certain passage that really strikes you as being meaningful, it's not the case that someone else reading the exact same book would be stricken the exact same way by the same passage. Okay, so the story that's playing out is that interaction right between you and the pages, the words on the pages. And so for Rogers, he wanted to take these ideas into the field of psychology, and it had an influence on research as well, right? This was the beginning of more qualitative types of research. I don't know if you've heard of interpretive phenomenological analysis, IPA, right? An approach in qualitative research in which you analyze interview transcripts and try to get data that way for studies rather than just, results from statistical techniques. But for Rogers, he wanted to move this into the field of therapy, focusing on the idea that therapists need to understand the client's subjective understanding of reality. For the behaviorists, right, and for the psychodynamic theorists, there was a clear way of doing things, right? And the idea really was for the behaviorists, if you follow these behavioral modification techniques, okay, then you'll be fine. Your behavior will change, and that'll be the end of it. And for Freud and those like him, again, it was the case that if people just got their act together, essentially, okay, then things would turn out well for them, okay. But for the more phenomenological point of view, you have to actually understand the fact that people perceive themselves differently, okay, based upon their circumstances. And maybe you have a friend who's feeling a bit depressed, right? And you can relate to this because what would you do? Would you begin, trying to understand their ids and ego and superego and telling them how to kind of get all that back in better balance? No, you would want to understand, how do they perceive themselves right now in the world? Do they have a sense of meaning, a sense of belonging? Do they have, friends that they can turn to when things are going bad? Do they have a job that they feel fulfills them, or do they feel as though they have something that they excel at? Do they have some sense of achievement, some sense of belonging, and so on? So you actually have to understand, the person's subjective sense of reality, right? Where they fall in the world, how they perceive the world, and how they come within it, in order to really help that person, right? So for Rogers, that really had to be the focus in therapy, seeing things through the eyes of the client and understanding that people see things differently. When it comes to the main reasons why people go to therapy, right? Sure, there are some people who are more likely to experience depression based upon genetic predispositions and traits like neuroticism. But for the most part, most people who go to therapy do so because of some dramatic life events, the loss of a job or the death of a loved one or the loss of a relationship or some loss of finances or, some big change that has them questioning, their sense of belonging, their sense of purpose and all of these things, okay? So for Carl Rogers, he was born in 1902 in Illinois. He actually wanted to be a minister. He came from a very religious family. And he thought that's what he wanted to do. He went to college and studied agriculture. But actually, during his time at college, he got interested in psychology and then kind of decided that's what he wanted to pursue. And he published Client-Centered Therapy in 1951, probably his best known text, but there's a number of well-regarded books that he's written. But he really revolutionized psychotherapy, okay? This idea that you have to be directed by the client, okay? Rather than the therapist being the interpreter, the one to tell them what to do, okay? Rather than them leading the direction of the process, okay? So in Carl Rogers's idea, people have a self-concept, okay, which is meaning who they regard themselves as being, how they see themselves. And sorry, this is missing an L. It should be self-ideal, okay? It's not self-idea. And they have a self-ideal, okay? An ideal version of themselves. So who they want to be. Now, what Rogers observed was that there was often a large discrepancy, okay, between one's self-concept and one's self-ideal in his patients, okay, talking about his patients. And for him, what he observed was typically those who were more disturbed or who had greater troubles, they had a larger discrepancy between their self-concept and their self-ideal. Now, he referred to this as incongruence, okay? Incongruence for him is the source of anxiety and mental distress, and it's the discrepancy between your self-ideal and your self-concept. If your self-concept matches up with your self-ideal, then that's congruence, right? They're congruent with one another. Whereas if there is disharmony, then there is incongruence going on there. I'll come back to how he actually measured this, okay, and what he would do to combat it. But, you know, much like Maslow and the other humanists, for Rogers, people are driven towards this natural progression of self-actualization, okay? Now, unlike Maslow, you know, Maslow said only 1% of people are self-actualizers, right? For Rogers, it's different. For Rogers, self-actualization is just the natural tendency, okay, for people. He uses the analogy of a flower to describe what he's talking about, and he says that, you know, a flower, its natural tendency is to grow, to flourish, okay, so long as it has all of the sunlight and water and everything it needs to survive, okay. And just like this, okay, people are also driven towards maintaining themselves and enhancing themselves, okay. But of course, if basic needs are not met, then that natural tendency will be disrupted. Okay, so for Rogers, a self-actualized person is someone who is experiencing congruence, okay? Their self-concept matches up with their self-ideal, okay? They're actually being who they want to be. And a fully functioning person can be used to describe someone who's on that process, okay? So they're working towards self-actualization, you know, they're not experiencing massive incongruence, okay? And they're working on being their self-ideal. They're getting closer and closer to it, okay? And for Rogers, what happens when you're a child in terms of your parenting is really massively influential on whether you become a fully functioning person or whether you experience incongruence, okay? Now, this is a pretty simple idea, but I really like Rogers's work, and I think his best work is on parenting. And out of all the theorists we've talked about, I think this is the most insightful on parenting, even though it's fairly simple. But for him, children have a need for positive regard, okay, which is kind of like Horney's idea of the safety needs, okay? You have a basic need to belong, to feel secure, to feel safe, okay? And parents can meet this positive regard in one of two ways, okay? They can give the child conditional positive regard, meaning that there are conditions of worth. You have to act this way in order to feel this positive regard, in order to get this sense of love and belonging. You have to be this way, okay? And if you don't follow that way, then you're not going to get this sense of love and belonging. Or you can give a child unconditional positive regard, okay? Meaning that even when they fall short, okay, they still know that they're loved and that they have a sense of belonging and so on. Now, in some ways, this is, for example, the parent who says, what you did was bad, you are bad, okay, which would be conditional positive regard, which means that the child is not really able to separate themselves from their behavior. They think that bad behavior defines them, okay? Whereas if you tell a child, what you did was bad, you can do better, you can learn from this, okay? That means that the child knows they're not defined by this behavior, okay? That they can learn from it, okay? So it's not about spoiling the child or telling the child that there's no consequences for their behavior. That isn't what Rogers is talking about, right? That can lead to narcissism, okay? It's having the child separate themselves, okay, from their behavior, knowing that they're still valued as people. Now, what Rogers argues is that this carries on into adulthood. If you receive conditional positive regard when you're a child, then once you're an adult, again, you think in order to be a person of value, you have to act in a certain way. And so you're constantly going to be worrying about what people think of you, how you're perceived, okay? You'll be more likely to distort reality, distort your shortcomings, try to come across better than you are, and so on, okay? Because again, you feel as though you only are worth something, okay, if you're actually achieving or being regarded as being good. Whereas those with an unconditional positive regard upbringing, when they grew up, they understand that their shortcomings don't define them and their mistakes don't define them. They're not going to hide these. They're more secure within themselves. Okay, so they can be more transparent and more open about their shortcomings. They're more, happy to grow and to take risks and to put themselves out there because they know that even if they make mistakes, okay, they can still learn from that and do better in the future. And they're not worried so much about people's judgments always on them. Okay. So if you receive conditional positive regard, okay, in childhood, you're less likely to be a fully functioning person striving towards self-actualization. You're more likely to have incongruence, okay? And you're more likely to be defensive in nature. You're more likely to be defensive in nature because, again, you're always worried about how people perceive you. You're worried about how you're coming across. And for Rogers, there's really two types of defenses mainly. Okay, there is denial, which is just simply not accepting any sort of reality that would challenge your self-ideal or make you feel insecure. You're just not accepting it, so you're in denial, right? And then the second one is distortion, okay, in which you're not in denial. It's the more common of the two. But you redefine the experience. You blame someone else for the shortcoming, or you try and justify your actions, rationalize it. Okay, there's some overlap here with the defense mechanisms, right? The more kind of conscious-like ones. Okay, so it's distorting reality in some way that makes you seem better, right? Some characteristics that Rogers observed in fully functioning people who are working towards self-actualization. They're more open to experiences. Again, they're more likely to take risks. They're more likely to put themselves out there. Again, less worried about shortcomings and so on. Existential living is really living in the moment, living in the present. Okay. Again, they're not worried about, oh, what an idiot I looked like yesterday. Okay, when I said that in this group, or when I made this mistake. They're not so worried about those issues in the past, and they're not so worried about wanting massive respect and success in the future in order to make people feel as though they're worth something. Okay, they can just be happy in the moment with how they are. Organismic trusting is really about trusting oneself, okay, having a good sense of values. Again, there's some overlap here, right, with the characteristics of self-actualizers in Maslow's theory. And so this means that they're more free to pursue what they actually want to pursue presently without having to be worried about shortcomings and distorting reality. and they're more creative, okay, in the ideas that they can come up with because they're more free as well. So for Rogers, he objected to how, at the time, therapists were really directing therapy sessions, believing that, decisions, big decisions, should be made by the clients themselves, and they should be the ones directing the process. He originally called it non-directive therapy, but he eventually realized that a therapist can't be entirely non-directive, even through, body language and so on. There's going to be some influence on direction. So he called it client-centered or person-centered therapy instead. And it's an idea, right, that's being used outside therapy as well. There's such a thing now as person-centered education, for example, which you tailor education to the person and it's more directed by the student. Okay, so, the therapist isn't the one to tell the client how to solve their problems. They're not the one to resolve the issues. The client has to come to these ideas themselves, these resolutions. If there's time, I'll give you an example of what this looks like. Otherwise, you can look at the video yourself. And for him, there's 3 conditions that need to be present in therapy for therapy to be successful. Okay, the therapist has to have empathy. They have to be able to actually put themselves in the shoes of their clients and actually relate to the feelings of their clients. Okay, so this would be part of understanding that subjectivity to reality. They have to give the client unconditional positive regard, okay, which might be different for the client if, for example, they experienced conditional positive regard in childhood, which is quite likely if they're experiencing severe incongruence. And so always being accepting, okay, of the client, making them know that this is a safe place, okay, and that they can reveal themselves without being judged, okay, they can speak their minds. And it all has to be genuine. For Rogers, a client will see through it, okay, if the therapist isn't being genuine, if they're actually not open to listening and wanting to get to know this particular client and actually wanting to help them. It all has to be genuine. So a technique that Rogers had was the Q sort for measuring incongruence. Now, what this is it's 2 stacks of cards, and the 2 stacks of cards are identical. They contain a number of characteristics. Okay, they might be adjectives you could use to describe yourself, such as being honest, also being successful. Okay, and now you ask the client to sort these once on their self-concept, so on who you are, okay, from least like you to most like you, okay? So, being successful, does that describe you a lot or not at all, okay? And then you ask them to do it again, but for their ideal self. And then they can actually compare clearly how in line are the two. Is their self-concept actually the same, or is it very different than their ideal self? And then you can actually measure the incongruence right then and there. And there's a video here you can watch that kind of demonstrates the Q sort. Now, the evidence does suggest actually that Rogerian therapy can be helpful in lessening this incongruence, and we can see this through the Q sorts. So, for example, if clients do the Q sorts in the first session, the correlation is pretty much about 0 between their ideal self and their self-concept. Okay, but after several months of therapy, okay, we then have a much stronger positive correlation, okay, between their ideal self and their self-concept. So it is becoming more in line, and they are lessening the incongruence. Okay, so there's some good evidence for his ideas, like I said, about changing in incongruence over the process of Rogerian therapy. Rogerian therapy has been shown to have quite a lot of success, and that's why it's still taught as an important component of therapy training today. And there is also some evidence that those who received unconditional positive regard do have a number of positive outcome benefits, okay? Whereas those who have conditional positive regard in childhood, they are more likely to be defensive, more likely to be anxious, more likely to have a number of other issues and relationships once they're older. So, the theory, much like Maslow's, puts the importance on the person having free will, them taking responsibility, them having freedom to make their own decisions, and so on. It's giving a more sophisticated idea because we're acknowledging that people perceive reality slightly differently and telling the therapist that they have to understand, the subjective understanding of the client in order to help them. And all of this, I would say, is valid on the face of it. And it's had a large impact on counseling, like I say. But maybe it's a bit too optimistic, to argue that the natural tendency for people is to enhance themselves and to always better themselves. Maybe that's not entirely always the case for everyone. It doesn't really put any importance on the unconscious. He's really seeing people as conscious beings and really just focusing on that influence. And it's all very difficult to objectify. And then, we can ask, are any therapists really non-directive? Okay. Okay, any questions on anything I've said here on Rogers or any of the humanists? Okay, remember you have the Big Five quiz that opens on Tuesday, due by the end of tomorrow. Otherwise, enjoy spring break, and I'll see you when you get back.